Thank you, Melanie, for that very kind introduction. Talofa, kia ora. The Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Right Honourable Winston Peters, started off his keynote this morning with his whakapapa. I'm not going to do my whakapapa, but one of the bits in my introduction that Melanie actually didn't read out is that it describes me as a Samoan chief. Now, I'm making this point, not because I want to tell you I'm a big chief, but rather to say it's a definitive element of what has brought me here, or in terms of my particular leadership. Most of you in this room would understand in Samoa we have a chiefly system called the Matai system. We're heads of very large extended families. And we're actually more trustees, rather than head honchos. Of course, there is status and privilege and so forth, but essentially, we play the role of stewards and guardians for our extended families. I have a very nice speech, in fact, two speeches. One from my ministry, which is the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment, and the other one, of course, from Foreign Affairs. I'm going to take a leaf out of Winston Peters' approach this morning. I'm going to give Melanie my speeches for her record, but but I thought it might be more useful if I just had a Telenor with you, because we don't often have the opportunity to have in the room the range of people and individuals representing not only themselves but the agencies that they are associated with. So we really didn't have a chance to sort of get to know each other, but I had my bilateral with the Deputy Prime Minister, and he said to me, there's a bit of a different buzz in this meeting. And I posited that that might be due to the fact that this is quite a different mix of people to have in the same room. So I wonder if I could just do a very quick sort of get to know. So of course I'm a government person, so hands up all the people here from government agencies. Majority. All right. Non-government community-based organizations. Private sector. Are we going to make a point about the church sector? No church sector? Well, we had the minister this morning. All right. So I thought that comment by Mr. Peters this morning, and I'm sure he's been to many forums, and I have also, and he said the response that he was getting is that people seem to be quite buzzed about being here and not completely falling asleep. So, I have limited time, so I thought I might just focus on just a very few things. This morning, we heard a lot about the Pacific and our region. A few months ago, I was invited to go and speak at one of the Australian universities about Pacific leadership. So I chose, as I began my remarks, by speaking about where my leadership comes from, which is essentially a collective. And when we're talking about the region, we're talking about that collective. And it's quite interesting what collectives are premised on. And of course, we're having this Telenor, in the context of the whole Brexit thing, that big collective, and with the UK moving away, we're also talking in the context of the global collective in many of our multilateral agreements, and we have a key player like the United States saying, nah, we don't want to be part of this. This is America first. So I think, this is a question that, well, I ponder on it. What is the meaning of a collective? More specifically, what's the meaning of our Pacific collective? So with the forum leaders throughout the years, since the forum has been in place, they have been the voice or the profile of what the Pacific collective is. We now hear the narrative of the Blue Pacific, and it speaks to our stewardship, our guardianship of our oceans continent. And it's very interesting in the earlier discussions this morning, when we were talking about who has control of the narrative. And I believe that the Blue Pacific narrative is our effort to take hold and have control of our narrative. And that has not always been easy for the Pacific. I think we are continuously challenged in having the control of that narrative. But nevertheless, I think it is so important as members of the global family that we, as a Pacific collective, are able to articulate what our story is, what our aspirations are, and where we want to go. So we're here for this conference. It is a New Zealand forum looking at our Pacific futures. And it speaks to the re-engagement or the continuation of the engagement. It's not a new engagement, it's been long engagement. I mean, I come from a country who has a history with New Zealand, administratively, politically. Many of us came through, or some of us now, those of us who are older, experienced the administrative period while New Zealand was there. But then a lot of the new generations now post-colonial experience. So I think, as we reflect on current issues, it's really important to understand the journey that we've all been on. And when we hear, I think the Deputy Prime Minister talked about broadening, deepening the relationship, we do acknowledge that history. And in acknowledging that history, being able to move forward and making progress. So some of us, actually, we were talking, as we do in the Pacific, about the reset, the step up, the uplift, and now more lately, the elevate. And we were talking about, cosmetic surgery, whether it was up here or down here. But the point is, we hope it's not cosmetic surgery. We do hope it is surgical in the sense that it's more direct and impactful in the decisions that we make. So one of the other, words coming to the fore is more mature relationships. And I think that is a natural thing when you have a relationship, and especially long-term relationships, that in order for them to be enduring, they do have to move through the stages. And when we talk about more mature relationships, then I think in itself that is recognition, not only where we're at, but where we would like to go to. Now, if we can just bring it down to climate change, which is, the main topic for this part of our session, I do want to say that from the Pacific Islands perspective, the change of policy in New Zealand with regards to climate change is so welcomed by the Pacific Island countries. Because when we're talking about our collective, the new alignment or the new policy shifts in New Zealand brings their climate change policy in alignment with what the Pacific has been saying for a very long time. And we were very happy to do that. Climate change is, the global experience. And from our region, it would be so good for all of us to be walking, the same path. I was invited to speak and join in with the Just Transition Conference that the Government of New Zealand hosted earlier this year. And some of the remarks by other speakers about the consultations and essentially taking the people along with us, especially, when governments are determining policies and different strategies, that there is that consultation that not only forms what the decisions are, but that people are also taking up the task, because one of the things that is acknowledged globally is that not one entity alone can fix the climate change challenge before us. All of us have to be actors. Now, I had a very interesting discussion with your Prime Minister at that conference, talking about the reset. And she said to me, and I thought that was very interesting, she said, the reset is as much about what New Zealand does in the region as it is about New Zealanders determining what they are, what is the identity of New Zealand, because that would dictate how it acts, not only internally, but externally as well. So it's a very admirable thing, I think, when governments have the opportunity to reflect inwardly about how they should proceed as a country, as a society, and especially in taking up a responsibility within their collective. And, we do acknowledge that New Zealand and Australia are the larger countries in our Pacific collective. So I really do want to sincerely acknowledge that shift with the New Zealand government, and who is a significant partner with us in the Pacific. Now, our cousins over the other way in Australia, they haven't made that shift, and it does give me sort of motivation. I mean, sure, we all understand why countries are not making a commitment to the levels of emissions that they should be adhering to. The vested interests in the, in the energy sector and so forth. But I reflect as a leader, as I'm sure we all do coming to this meeting, what are the decisions and the choices that we should be making in order, not only for our planet to survive, but that our generations can enjoy this planet in the times to come. What is our responsibility in the here and now to ensure that. Now, we all know that climate change has a multiplier effect, and especially in terms of our security. And that brings me to the point, talking about security, in that once again the Pacific, as a region of smaller states, we are taking the lead globally in raising the discussion about the inclusion of climate change or climate impact on security, and that the definitions of security should be broadened to bring those elements in. So the advocacy role, I think, of our region has been quite significant given our size. We advocated strongly for the 1.5 Celsius, as opposed to, the 2%. Against all odds, because most of the world were going, no, we can't possibly do that. The least we could accommodate is 2%. But the Pacific kept at it and kept at it in its advocacy work. Now, I come from a small country. I'm reminded of the late Tupou Lima, when he was the Crown Prince of Tonga, and he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And someone said to him, Minister, what is your country's foreign policy, generally? And he said, foreign policy? We don't have foreign policy. So the journalist was a bit perplexed, and he said, surely you must have foreign policy. You're the Minister of Foreign Policy, so therefore there must be foreign policy. And so those of you who might have known Tupou Lima, he was quite an eccentric character. So he says in his very sort of upper crust English accent, he sort of said, my dear friend, you've got to understand that we're small countries. We don't make policy, we just navigate our way around other people's policies. And I won't say that that's a sad truth. I would have to say that that's just the truth. And that's the lot of Pacific Island countries. Navigation. Now, Samoa was called the Navigation Islands because of supposedly its prowess in, navigation. But, I think it's a good motif, and especially as ocean countries, because that is our reality. We navigate. We navigate, and we're a bit like water. We have to find our way. And as we all know, with climate change and the impacts of, natural disasters, water does find its way. And the Pacific will also find its way for its survival. So, once again, when we're talking about climate change and the Pacific and our collective effort, I've spoken about advocacy, the mitigation elements. As a region, we've prioritized renewable energies. But it's quite interesting. Sometimes you think things have changed, but then not really changed. With the renewable energies, it's one of the saviors of our response to climate change. But renewable energy is also a new industry, and it's a huge industry. Even the Arab countries with all their oil and so forth, they're really getting into renewable energy because they want to get ahead of that game. It's big business, and they have the resources to do that. So, the Pacific are doing their part with the renewable energy. It's a great saving, of course, with all the money that we spend on oil. But once again, the experience on the ground with this new way of work, it's business as usual. It's still the people with all the resources. It's the people who have the advantage on the information. And once again, we find ourselves on the back foot. So, when the question is asked, what do Pacific Islands do? What do Pacific leaders do? One of the answers to that is that we really do have to up our game. And that is part, when we're having the conversation with our partners, how willing are our partners to up our game so that we can, have that ideal of the level playing field, talking about rugby, and all the discussion around rugby as well, and how uneven that playing field is. I'd have to say, New Zealand, you have your part to play in that uneven playing field. We can't just blame the Northern Hemisphere. But that is the challenge when we're talking about our partnerships, our relationships. Will you really help us up? And this is one of the questions when we come to adaptation. There's a lot of money around. Audrey Moore from SBC says that we probably receive more money per capita than any other area in the world. Are we seeing the impacts of that? Has that been useful to us? I think Audrey also made the comment that actually managing all that resource is a big challenge. And we do need your help in working through with us on how we can best use the resources. And sometimes it's not about the money. Sometimes it's more about the visioning, it's more about the planning. Sustainability, of course, has been a word that's been bandied. And sustainability has been around for us a long time. But one of the things I've also been reflecting about, and when we talk about investment, I think one of the critical things about maturing relationships is when we can have that very frank exchange about, is the investment enough? And are we doing enough to ensure that that investment becomes a solid building block to carry on, our further work? So adaptation is actually going to be a big challenge for the region. And, we talk a lot about accessing finances. I think we're doing quite well with that. But more to the point, what are we going to do about this? There is a responsibility for us in the Pacific to also utilize those resources in the most appropriate way. It's our contribution to, although, we're not emitting and so forth, but in our adaptations, we must also ensure, the integrity of how we carry out that work. Which perhaps brings me to one last point, because, Mr. Chairman, are you keeping time on me? This essentially, I started off with leadership, and I think I'd like to end with leadership. The leadership is so critical in our effort. Governance under that leadership is very critical. We've heard the words through our security discussions this morning about corrupt practices and all the other influences. But if there's one thing, I think for us in the Pacific, we've got so many challenges. But if we do not get our leadership and our governance elements in place, I think our journey will be even more difficult. So I think I might end there, the Telenor. And if you have any questions for me, that's fine. If you don't, that's even better.